Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. We're excited to have such a good group in front of us to talk with you about emerging technologies in learning. I'm going to start by briefly introducing myself, my colleague, and our organization. My name is Karen Hebert-Maccaro. I am O'Reilly's Chief Content Officer. Prior to that, though, I was a Chief Learning Officer for 6 years, and prior to that, I was an academic. I taught business at 2 universities in the States, so I've spent my life thinking about learning and how to bring learning to mostly adult learners. And so I'm pleased to be here with my colleague, Andrew Odewahn. Andrew is O'Reilly's Chief Technology Officer, and also a former software engineer, maybe still in many ways, and an MBA. Somebody who brings the technology side to my learning side. So hopefully today we'll give you a few things that you can take away from and feel is helpful. The company that we work for, you may be familiar with. O'Reilly has been in existence for about 40 years, and you may have heard of us because of our founder, Tim O'Reilly, who has been cited as creating the open source software movement. You may be familiar with our iconic animal books. We started as a technical training book publisher, have evolved to be a learning company, and today you may be familiar with our online learning platform called Safari. And throughout the course of this presentation, we'll give you some insight into the stuff we're doing inside the Safari product in particular, and how we think emerging technologies are becoming a big and powerful part of the learning imperative. So without further ado, I'm going to move us forward, but I do want to remind you that if you have questions after the presentation, we are in S13. You can stop by, and we're also providing some copies of our white paper on emerging technology. So if you want to learn more than what we talk about in this 30-minute presentation, stop by S13, and we'd be glad to answer questions and provide you with a copy. To begin with, I want to talk about something I think we're probably all familiar with, but I call it the learning imperative. The learning imperative essentially is the justification, in my mind, for the investment in learning. And inside our corporations, we are already seeing big shifts in the way people learn. In large part, the learning imperative is fueled by some social issues, including the war on talent or the war for talent. It's increasingly difficult to get talent into our organizations, and when we have turnover, it's increasingly costly to the organizations, right? So I think Forrester research says that it's usually between 6 and 9 months of a person's salary in cost to replace them. So turnover is costly, talent is hard to find. Moreover, the millennial generation actually has consistently rated learning, professional development, their own career growth as more important than most other perks, and even in some instances salaries. So on the one hand, it's hard to get us to a good talent base, but once we get them, it's incredibly important that we keep them because it's costly. And how do we keep them? We do that because we provide opportunities for them to grow, develop, learn, and build their careers. And all of this is coupled with some pretty phenomenal technological changes. You know, they say now the average shelf life of a skill set is 3 to 4 years, and that the average person is going to have somewhere around 11 jobs in their lifetime. And oftentimes, that's going to cross different functional areas. So they're really creating mini careers for themselves multiple times, which means upskilling and reskilling is incredibly important. The last thing I'll mention is that our companies and organizations are all working in incredibly complex and competitive environments. And as a result, we see that they need to continually reinvent themselves as an organization to remain competitive. So they need to upskill and reskill their workforce unless they're going to have to go out and replace their workforce, every couple of years in order to compete. So we've got this tremendous force behind us to create great learning experiences, to attract talent, retain talent, and remain competitive. And that's what we call the learning imperative. The problem, or the challenge, maybe it's a challenge, but the challenge in this is that in most organizations, we see a fair amount of resistance to making the learning and development programs more contemporary and to meet the needs of the more contemporary learner. How many of you, just show of hands, feel like today in your organizations, you're doing a spectacularly good job at meeting the needs of your learners? Anybody? Maybe a few of you? Maybe a few of you. I mean, I think we're probably doing great jobs in some areas and feel like maybe in other areas we're not as strong, right? I mean, and what I think we've got is a few things that are in our way. So I'm going to share a couple of things that I think are in our way, and then I'm going to share some things that I think we can actually do to overcome those things. The first thing is a tool issue. A problem of having, sort of tools that are largely incapable or not designed to meet the needs of the modern learner, right? So how many of you love your LMS? Show of hands. Love it. Okay, a couple of you, good. There's some people cracking up too. So not everybody loves their LMS, and I'm not trying to hate on LMSs. I'm saying that we're working with tools that were designed for different purposes, and now we are competing against people who have essentially every bit of content and information they want in the palm of their hands through their smartphones. And so it's easier to Google or to look something up on YouTube than it is to access our LMSs or other learning platforms and to get the information we need in the moment. And so it's challenging for L&D to create programs and experiences that really actually meet the learner at the point of need. But it's not just a tools problem. I also, having come out of the L&D world, know that it's a bit of a construction problem. What is L&D? Maybe some of you are doing great work in this space, and I'd love for you to stop by the booth and share it with me. But I know a lot of conversations are ongoing around, wait a minute, what are we as L&D professionals, as learning professionals? Are we traditional classroom trainers? Are we e-learners, e-learning builders? Are we performance support? What should we be doing? What should be part of our portfolio? And I think the answer is it's got to be all of it. We have to become architects of learning ecosystems that are much more robust than most of the ones that exist today. And we'll talk about how we do that. So lest you think that I don't have a tremendous amount of respect for the work of L&D, which I do, the L&D world is doing some great things. Formal training, we do it pretty well, generally speaking, in my experience. That's classroom training, that's formal e-learning, things of that nature. Immersion experiences, whether it be onboarding or leadership trainings, we tend to do those things extraordinarily well, in my experience. But I have an incomplete picture up here. What I think we have is an opportunity to round out this portfolio in two ways. And those two ways are what I call high interaction, high scale experiences. You might hear me refer to them as high I, high S going forward. And performance support, and in particular, performance adjacent learning. And I'll define both of these things for you in the next couple of slides. But this is where I see we have the opportunity to meet the learner at their point of need. Digital learning, point of need learning, it's not coming, it's here. Like I said, we're all doing it when we Google something to get an answer quickly. And so does that devalue or undervalue the learning experiences that we provide in the classroom or in immersion type experiences? Absolutely not. But we also have to meet the learner in these spaces too. So this is a graphic that I put together to illustrate the fact that, we have this spectrum of interactivity and scale, right? Because in organizations, we're constantly dealing with cost and efficiency and scalability of our programs. And what you'll see is that I feel we have done a pretty good job avoiding the low interaction, the low scale kinds of events. We tend to limit the straight lecture only types of things where people are passively receiving information with very little interaction to small chunks of time or in particular situations. And so that's great. We also do a pretty good job, as I mentioned, with the high interaction but low scale events. Those are the immersion experiences, the classroom trainings. You might be able to get 100 people, maybe 150, but interaction is going to be limited in that environment. And so in the other category, we have the high scale but low interaction experiences, and I don't know how many of you are willing to admit this, but I am guessing that there is a fair number of training experiences inside your organizations that are talking PowerPoint, you flip through, or you got, some of you know what I'm talking about. At the end, you might have to, say, yes, I did this, but, very low interaction, right? And what I'm arguing is that we need to go to the top right, and we need to focus on the top right, where we have high scale, high interaction events, and technology is going to enable that. So that's high I, high S. The second concept I want to share with you is this notion of performance support and performance adjacent learning. How many of you are familiar, show of hands, with performance support? So performance support is essentially, for those of you who aren't as familiar with it, learning that occurs embedded in the workflow. So a great example of that would be if you have a call center or something of that nature where an individual might be receiving a call from a customer or a prospect, and there's a workflow that they go through on their computer terminal, and then what happens is they get a chance to sort of see pop-ups that instruct them, this type of question typically gets answered by doing this and things like that. So they're literally learning as they go. It's a brilliant kind of job aid, and it's extremely helpful, but the disadvantage of performance support that is embedded in the workflow is that you have to have a performance support program for each workflow. Performance adjacent learning is actually a bit more scalable. And performance adjacency is something that we use to describe a tool, a program, a set of content, an experience that can be accessed with minimal friction and then jumped out of back into the workflow. So I'm going to give you a quick example. Our platform, the Safari platform, has actually been used by one of our clients to solve a very significant problem with a piece of their technology, their chip and pin system. And the software engineer who, in the moment, was struggling to solve this problem, which was costing them, hundreds of thousands of pounds an hour, they were able to jump into Safari, get the answer, and fix the problem. And the customer estimated that they saved over £500,000 just in getting that answer within 10 minutes. And so they jumped in, they got a quick answer, they jumped back out, they solved the problem in the workflow. That's a great example of performance adjacent learning. And there's more by way of technology to facilitate that today than ever before. And we're going to show you some examples of that. So, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew, who's going to take you through some of the ways that we're working on both high I, high S and performance adjacent learning experiences within O'Reilly.
Great. Thanks so much, Karen, and good morning, everybody. As Karen mentioned, we've been looking at a number of technologies that address both of these aspects of learning. So I want to go through it in a specific case study, which is meeting the insatiable demand for AI, ML, and big data. This is something that wasn't even a job category just 5 years ago, and now it's some of the hottest technologies on the planet. And so organizations and individuals are really struggling to come up to speed on some of these things. And what I want to talk about are two technologies that we're using that allow us to, I'm getting a little feedback here, that allow us to use those, the high learning, high scale, and that's Jupyter Notebooks. And the second is performance adjacent, so that you're able to jump in and get some quick information for addressing a question or maybe filling in a gap of your knowledge, and that's Alexa. So, first, Jupyter Notebooks. What is it? It's an open source tool that's a free and open source. You can go use it now. That was created by two scientists, Fernando Perez and Brian Granger at the University of Berkeley. And it came out of the scientific computing environment. And what it allows you to do is create documents that have narrative text and math equations and code samples. But you can also not just look at the code sample, you can run it right within the context of the document. So if you have a Python program that's going to make a graph or compute some kind of machine learning algorithm, you can run it with this tool and store that output in the document itself. And it's become an amazingly popular way for people who are prototyping and creating different kinds of computational environments to do their work and do it in that environment. It's got about 2 to 3 million users, and so what I want to do now is just show a quick demo of it in action so you can get a sense of what the tool is like. And just as a little bit of context here, this is a book that we wrote that was written by a data scientist named Jake Vanderplas, who's a professor at the University of Washington, and it's called the Python Data Science Handbook. And you can go to this GitHub page and follow along from your own device if you want to. I've been bitten enough by live demos to know that it's probably a good idea to show a video, so I'll just start it now. If we can change the audio, please. Can you raise the volume?
And if I scroll down to the beginning of the README, I can click on this Launch on Binder button. And what Launch on Binder is going to do is clone that repository, install it on a GitHub container, on a Docker container that's also running Jupyter. And once Jupyter starts and the Docker container starts, I've actually got a running instance of a notebook that represents a live version of that content. So if I go down to the histograms and binnings chapter, I can look at this, and this is the actual editing environment of the notebook itself. As you can see, I've got controls for common actions such as saving a file, or editing, or viewing, the kinds of things that you would have in any other editing environment like a Google Docs or Microsoft Word. I can edit content itself, so if I say I want to take out the word simple from a simple histogram, I can do that. The most interesting aspect of the notebook is the ability to run code live. So this is a Python example that's actually being executed, and the results are being stored within the content of the notebook itself. So I'm able to run and insert a live graph into my document, just like any other kind of content. And if I want to edit this content, I can do that, say to get more a smaller binning density so that I can see more fine-grained distribution. And the idea of the notebook is really to create this beautiful experience that interweaves code and narrative text and images and interactive widgets all into one experience. And so it's a great tool for really learning and understanding data science and having a rich interaction with your computing environment.
Great. So, as I mentioned, this came out of the University of Berkeley, and this is one of the first programs to offer a data science major. So there's an undergraduate degree that you can get from Berkeley, and the whole curriculum is based on Jupyter Notebooks. So when you take a class in this program, you go into into your program, follow along with the professor in a live environment where you're able to do a regression or use TensorFlow or really do anything in the data science realm, but do it live, which makes for a very different learning experience than just passively listening to a professor talk on the chalkboard. And one of the reasons why it works so well is that it just creates a really engaging experience. This is Professor Lorena Barba, who is an aeronautical engineer and professor at the George Washington University. And she's observed that the notebooks give a kind of a tactile experience and a way to interact with content and computation in a much richer fashion than just reading about it passively and going through it as you on your own time and your own device. And so really it's an active learning experience that works, and it's one of the few tools out of the box where you're really able to create these sort of really rich learning experiences for different tools. But the interesting thing about the notebook is it's not just a tool for learning. It's also a tool that data scientists use for their daily work. So there was a study conducted by Kaggle, which is a division of Google that runs data science competitions, and they surveyed 8,000 data scientists, and Jupyter was the fourth most used tool in their toolbox. So behind Python, R, and SQL, Jupyter was the tool that was most used for really pulling those the whole set of tools together. And so it's emerged as an incredibly important tool set, not just as the learning, but also as just working. And as further evidence of that, this is Amazon SageMaker is a product that was just released by Amazon last reInvent. And it's basically a machine learning in the cloud. And the idea is you put your data and your machine learning models up into Amazon, and they can run a whole pipeline for you so that you don't have to run that infrastructure yourself. And the front end to that experience is a Jupyter Notebook. So you go in, you train your model on your data, you create the kind of computational environment that you want to have. Once you've defined that in the notebook, you pass it off into this data pipeline, and that's where it gets executed in production. So it's a very, very powerful process that's becoming just the front end to data science generally. And within Safari, we're exploring it in a number of different ways. So first are just writing books and text, and that's, I showed you the example earlier of Jake Vanderplas's book and with Binder. And the second is instructor-led trainings. So like in the Berkeley example, you can be in the Safari platform and follow along on an online instructor in a notebook and try your own variations. Work with the material that you're learning about live during the instruction. And if you have questions, you're able to ask and interact there. And then finally, we have a product called Orioles, and this is a combination of a video and a notebook and text. And so rather than having an online instructor, you get an asynchronous experience where you can follow along the video at your own time and be walked through the computation and through the steps. So that's kind of the first dimension, this high interaction, high scale. But if you're like me and you haven't had a statistics class in 20 years and you can't remember what a histogram is, you also sometimes need that quick performance adjacent support that will let you just say, hey, I don't know what a histogram is. I wish somebody could tell me. And what we're doing for that is using the Alexa as a technology and voice interface technology to provide that kind of support. And so what I want to talk about is a skill we're working on called What Is, that just lets you answer basic questions about technology and about different topics in data science. So, but voice is something that's really emerging as a new way of learning and creating experiences. So before I kind of dive into what the technology is, I just want to introduce you to sort of a 5-part things as you're thinking about how to use voice and how to create these learning experiences that you ought to be aware of. So the first is just the idea of a skill, right? This is basically like an application. Think of it as like your website or as like a mobile application. And the thing that makes it unique is it also has something called an invocation name. And this is the thing you have to say to actually get the device to respond and execute and open your skill. Then the next level is intents, and these are the things that are inside your skill, the functions that the skill performs. So you can think of these as the main building blocks of the experience. And so an intent might be like our what is skill, or the what is intent. What is a thing? You might say play a video. You might say tell me what's related to something. So that's kind of the subfunction. The third are utterances. And what utterances are the different ways that people might express that intent. So you may say, I don't know what a histogram is. Tell me what a histogram is. What is a histogram? I want to learn about histograms. All those different ways that people might express the same idea to map it is something you need to think about and train Alexa how to map those to the intent that you have. The fourth concept are slots, and those are essentially like the variables. So in the what is skill, the slots are TensorFlow or histogram or R squared value. All the things that are basically like the variables that get passed to the intent. And then the final aspect is fulfillment. And this is really where your development team would come in and be able to take the identified intent that you want to run and the slot values that you want to run it on, and they write the code that actually goes and answers that intent. And so as a learning and developer, whether you're in Alexa or you're in Google's the Google Home Kit or Cortana, you'll spend a lot of time on a screen like this. And this is basically a GUI that allows you to define all that information. You can say, here are my intents, here are the slots, here are the utterances. So you spend a lot of time really in your learning design experience here. And then the next stage is once you've got that, you pass it off to the developer team, or maybe you're a developer yourself, and they'll create functions like this that will say, for that specific intent, with that specific value, here's how I go get what Alexa is going to say as a response. And what we found as we're working through this process and thinking about how we build these experiences is that often this process is just a matter of using APIs that you've already built and that you probably already have in your mobile application or in your website, but just putting a new interface on it. So voice isn't necessarily just a completely new revolutionary way of doing things. It's just really a different kind of client that you're dealing with. And there's some special cases that you might have to work around the edges of. But by and large, it's not a very disruptive programmatically and technologically. It's much more about creating the great experience. So what I want to do now is show another quick video of Alexa in action and sort of how these different parts of the framework are related. So if we can turn the volume back up again on the video, please.
For example, I'm using a tool called Spoken, which allows you to monitor the requests and responses to and from the device. And so the first thing I want to show is what happens when you don't use the right invocation name for your skill. Alexa, what is Jupiter?
Jupiter is the 5th planet from the Sun and the largest in the solar system.
And now when I use the right invocation name. Alexa, Ask Safari what is Jupyter.
An open source web application that allows you to create and share documents that contain executable code, equations, visualizations, and narrative text.
So with this kind of power, you can imagine having a device like an Alexa sitting next to your desk and be able to ask questions as you're going through a rich Jupyter notebook. For example, you might say, Alexa, ask Safari what is a histogram.
A chart that shows a numerical distribution by sorting them into bins of a specific size.
And so once I have the correct response back, I can go inspect it in the bespoken console. And I can see that my intent was to search the ontology, and the slots that Alexa found was the word histogram, so that's what it picked out. It used that to query the API that I use as the basis for fulfilling the intents, and it generates the response, which is a speech output that we just heard it read.
Great. So that's kind of a basic flow of the way that skills work. And as you go back to your enterprise or your organization and think about bringing these in, some of the challenges that we've encountered are first, Echo and the Echo Dot are consumer devices. So if you want to use it within an enterprise context and say you're a financial services organization or a healthcare organization, you don't necessarily want to publish all your skills to the to Amazon's Alexa store, right, where anybody can go install them. So to get around this problem, there's an alternate service offering called Lex. And what Lex is basically a way that you can create a white labeled version of Alexa that you can embed inside your own application. So if you have a mobile app and you want to enable it to use voice technology, you would use Lex to do that. The second problem that we've encountered is specialized technical terminology. And that's things like, and for us, things like Docker or Kubernetes or TensorFlow, things that really aren't standard words that people are normally using in just a consumer context. And to get around that, you can provide Alexa with additional special vocabulary lists that it will use when you go and build the model and train it. It'll recognize those terms and it will pick those up and be able to translate them more accurately. So for example, when you go to TensorFlow, go to Alexa and ask about Docker, it may think you said doctor. Or if you're asking about some other term, it just doesn't pick it up very well. So if you're doing this kind of work, I've written a small utility to help format that kind of information where you can just put a list of your terms in and get something that's Alexa friendly back out. That's the URL for it. And then the final piece where you might encounter some issues is most of these services are really tightly coupled to the cloud providers that are giving them. So, if you're using Alexa, you're on AWS, but if you're using Google, you're in Google's environment, or Microsoft's Cortana has its own environment. And so your IT teams and the teams that are working on this need to have some facility with those cloud service providers. And so if you're not already using those services, it's a good opportunity to really find a very specific area where you can begin bringing those into your organization.
So, as we wrap up, I hope a couple of things have become clear. First is whether you buy this type of technology or these types of high I, high S experiences or performance adjacent experiences, or whether you build them in-house, that the learning ecosystems that we are creating are certainly going to become increasingly robust and different than they are in existence today as emerging technologies continue to change the way that we do business. One of the things that we talk about at O'Reilly is the next economy, and the next economy is lots of things, but one of the things it is an economy where humanity and artificial intelligences and emerging technologies are increasingly merged to create more productive, more high-performing employees and human beings, and I think that that's an incredibly exciting concept, and I hope that you enjoyed the opportunity to see how we're thinking about it at O'Reilly, and how we're bringing performance adjacency into our products, and how we're trying to bring more high-S experiences into our products. So thank you for taking the time to come to our conversation today. And Andrew and I will be here for a little bit longer, and then at booth S13, we'd welcome the opportunity to meet you and talk with you. Thank you.
Thank you.